Are we on? Okay. Welcome everyone to my presentation on crafting a legal smart contract. My name is Johnfar Kerlee, but I like to go by Julian. And I have a law firm. The name of my law firm is Vitalik. And I would like to thank the Miami Blockchain Center for hosting my presentation today. So I want to give you a little bit of more background on myself. I'm a lawyer, as I said. I have a degree in mechanical engineering as an undergraduate, and I've been a U.S. patent attorney for over 20 years with experience in intellectual property law. I obtain and litigate patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets for my clients. I also do a lot of intellectual property licensing. As well, I counsel in contract negotiations, and I have experience with machine learning, blockchain, augmented reality, virtual reality, IoT, a lot of the emergent technologies. I also have experience with autonomous vehicles and robotics, and I like to code. So I have some skills in Python, Solidity, C#, and other front-end and back-end tools. You can reach me at LinkedIn, and also through my email address. I will post this information later on at the end of the presentation, just to remind you how to get in touch with me. You can also see the URL for my website, enteliki.law. So that's how to get a hold of me. And before we start, I'd like to make sure that we all understand that nothing in this presentation is legal advice, and it's only for informational purposes. The information may not be valid where you live, so you have to consult your local laws, and you should consult an attorney if you have any particular issues or problems. And obviously, the participation in this presentation does not create an attorney-client relationship between myself and any of the participants. Okay, so backtrack. I want to use this slide to make the main point of the presentation, which is that not all smart contracts are legal contracts. And now there's this category of contracts which are being referred to in legal circles and other places as legal smart contracts. And that's what this presentation is about. How do we make a smart contract into a legal smart contract? I would like to present a little more nuanced view of the situation. So in general, there are agreements that people can make. And in that universe of agreements, there are some agreements that are enforceable by the law. And what I mean by enforceable by the law, that means that you can bring in the power of the state, the power of the third party, to force the parties to perform according to the agreement they made. Now, you can see that not all agreements are legal contracts. Not all agreements are enforceable by the law. And now we have this category of smart contracts. And as I said before, not all smart contracts are legal contracts, and not all smart contracts are agreements. And so now we have a category that are these legal smart contracts. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, how to craft a legal smart contract. And before, to start with that, then we're going to talk about some basic contract law principles. Now, a contract is a promise or a set of promises for the breach of which the law gives a remedy, or the performance of which the law in some way recognizes as a duty. So that's basically legalese to say that there are certain kinds of promises that one or both the parties can make use of the powers of the state to enforce those promises. That's the basic notion of a legal contract. Now, for a legal contract to be enforceable, there are some minimum requirements. One of those requirements is that there has to be an offer. You also have to have an acceptance, and finally, consideration. So these are the three minimum requirements for a legally enforceable contract. What is an offer? An offer is the manifestation of willingness to enter into a bargain, so made as to justify another person in understanding that assent to that bargain is invited and will conclude it. Again, that's a lot of heavy legalese for basically saying that you have to have an indication by someone that they're willing to enter into a bargain. Similarly, an acceptance is a definite and unequivocal manifestation of a present contractual intent. Again, that is just legalese for saying that you have to demonstrate a clear intent to enter into a bargain with someone who's making you an offer. And then finally, the consideration is an act, forbearance, or the promise thereof, done or given by one party in return for the act or promise of another. So what this basically means is that it has to be something of value that is being exchanged. Now, typically it could be a product, it could be a service, but it could also, consideration could be just the promises themselves that are made. Now, these are the three basic requirements for what we call in the legal profession contract formation. So you have to have these three things in place for a set of promises to be enforceable by the law. There are other requirements. For example, you have to have a contract that is for a lawful purpose. The law won't enforce a contract the subject matter of which is illegal. For example, the sale of illicit drugs or some illicit activities like prostitution. So if somebody makes an agreement for the sale of drugs or for prostitution, no court is going to enforce such things. Then you have to have legal capacity, which basically means that the parties have to be capable of understanding what they're getting into. So, for example, you can't have an enforceable agreement between a minor and another party because the law doesn't consider the minor to be capable of entering into a contract. And then there has to be some reasonably definite terms. This part is more like part of the acceptance and the offer, and it relates to things like you want to have a price, you want to have a quantity, and there is some flexibility here on exactly how definite they have to be, but you definitely need some what would be considered normally in the context of the transaction. What's a reasonable minimum information you need, like price and quantity, for there to be a deal. So now those are the basics of a contract law and what you need to form an agreement that is going to be enforceable by the courts, the juries, and generally the legal system. Now, what are smart contracts? Now, I'm assuming that most of the people in our audience are familiar with blockchain and smart contracts. And so for you, some of you, this might be very trivial. For some of you, this may be new. But we're going to start from some of the basics. So a smart contract, in 1994, Nick Szabo came up with a concept, with the notion, and he defined a smart contract as a computerized transaction protocols that execute the terms of a contract. So what he had in mind was some sort of automation of contracts, so automating the performance of a contract. And then in 1996, he came out with a book, Smart Contracts, Building Blocks for Digital Markets. And in it, he defined a smart contract as a set of promises specified in digital form, including protocols within which the parties perform on these promises. So again, his original notion of a smart contract was this automated digital performance of the terms of an agreement, of a contract. And I'm sure, as a matter of fact, Nick Szabo was a lawyer. He graduated from law school, and he very much had in mind that smart contracts had to do with what he wanted them to be very related to legal contracts. So what has happened since then is that the definition of a smart contract has kind of evolved, and there's been several definitions, and sometimes it's difficult to talk about smart contracts because people have different definitions. So I pulled one from Wikipedia, which, it tends to be the repository of general knowledge. And in Wikipedia, a smart contract is defined as a computer protocol intended to digitally facilitate, verify, or enforce the negotiation or performance of a contract. So again, you can see that a smart contract is placed in this context of a legally enforceable contract. And then this is another definition from the same source. A smart contract is a computerized transaction protocol that executes the terms of a contract. It's actually a little bit of a circular definition there, but you get the point. Now, proponents of a smart contract claim that many kinds of contractual clauses may be made partially or fully self-executing, self-enforcing, or both. Now, this part here, I think, is important to highlight, because you notice how this definition or this point says that the contracts are self-executing or self-enforcing. So there are two different concepts, and I'll talk about that in a minute more. And then in 2018, a US Senate report said that while smart contracts might sound new, the concept is rooted in basic contract law. With smart contracts, a program enforces the contract built into the code. So again, this notion that a smart contract is basically the automation of a legal contract. But that's not how things have turned out to be, not as simple as that. So we have these Ethereum smart contracts, which is what most developers and most people in blockchain tend to think about. When we think about smart contracts, we're thinking about these Ethereum smart contracts. So the Ethereum white paper defines a smart contract as essentially an automated agent that lives on the Ethereum network, has an Ethereum address and balance, and can send and receive transactions. Now we can see based on this definition that it doesn't say anything about an offer, it doesn't say anything about an acceptance, nothing about consideration. It talks about sending and receiving transactions, but that's nothing really that relates to a formal legal contract. Let's see. And here's an example of an Ethereum smart contract that is not a contract at all. This is a smart contract that basically implements a social network distributed app. And here we have the social network functionality is to create posts, list all the posts, tip the posts. And you can see over here on the source code for the smart contract, you can see that we have a structure for the post, and then we have a function to create the post and a function to tip the post. And so here we have a smart contract, an Ethereum smart contract that has nothing to do with legal contracts. So this is a smart contract that is not a legal smart contract. And as a matter of fact, Vitalik Buterin, who is the principal founder behind Ethereum, he posted in 2018 on a tweet that, to be clear, at this point, I quite regret adopting the term smart contracts. I should have called them something more boring and technical, perhaps something like persistent scripts. So there had been this recognition that smart contracts are not necessarily the same thing as legal contracts, legally enforceable contracts. And here we have an example of a project called Smart Wedding Contract on Ethereum testnet with Solidity. Now, what this smart contract purports to do is to create a situation where a couple is getting married, and then the guests get to vote whether the couple should get married or not. So you have a guest list, and then you have a method to object against the marriage, a method to vote for the marriage, and then canceling the wedding. Now, of course, this could be an agreement in between people, and this may be fun or whatever, but this is not a legal contract. No court is going to enforce this contract. So here we have something that looks kind of like a contract, but it's not a legal smart contract. Now here we have an example of a project. It's the Ethereum share house. And what these people have done is they've created a Ethereum smart contract where people who share a house put money into a shared fund, and then when the expenses are paid out, or when someone in the house pays for an expense of the house, they can submit a reimbursement request to the smart contract. And then if the housemates vote that the reimbursement should be made, then the smart contract pays out the reimbursement. Now, this looks more like an enforceable contract because there is some sort of an offer and acceptance. The offer being, hey, let's put the money into this pot, and then you accept by putting the money into the pot. And then the consideration is, if you make the thing of value is the expenses that are incurred and then getting reimbursed. And so let's say that I made a request because I spent some money for a house expense, and now I expect to be reimbursed, and I make the request to the smart contract, and my housemates decide not to reimburse me, decide not to vote. In that case, I probably could go to court and force my housemates to make good on the smart contract. Now, here's what I want to talk about, this notion that performance is not the same thing as enforcement. So you could have something where a contract is self-executing or automatically executing, but that's not the same thing as self-enforcing, because conceptually, performance of a contract is separate from enforcement of a contract. Enforcement comes into play when a third party, usually the state, becomes involved in forcing one or both of the parties to take actions to ensure that the promises are kept. So typically, a contract doesn't live in something like, the code. It really is something that is a relationship between parties that is enforced, if it needs to be enforced, by a third party. And now the state will not enforce the contract if the contract does not comply with the legal requirements of an enforceable agreement. And then, so recently, a lot of legal expertise has gone in trying to understand these new contracts, and this category of smart legal contracts has become something that people can talk about. And it's generally defined as a legally binding digital agreement in which part or all of the agreement is intended to execute as algorithmic instructions. So if you put all the pieces together, all the requirements of the legal framework together with algorithmic instructions that perform some or all of the clauses, the promises, then you have a smart legal contract. As a matter of fact, there is these two Australian attorneys who have come up with what they call the Lightson and Garside model of a smart legal contract, and it has these components. So number one is the status. It has to be legally binding. It conforms to established rules of contract. So you have a digitally based part, but it has to be legally binding. It has, when it is crafted, when it is created, it has to be its base. If it's going to be enforceable, it has to be based on the established rules of contract. Now, the form is that it's machine readable or digital state. So not all of it, but at least part of it is digitized, automated. Now, the contents of a smart legal contract, you would have part of it is natural language, like in typical contracting and business language, and part of it is computer code. It's an interesting thing to note here. I believe that part of the natural language, you could have a whole contract living in the blockchain, and you could use the comments of the smart contract to include the natural language and put in the typical natural language legalese that goes with contracts, with your, your regular standard contracts. And so if you put that into the comments of your smart contract, I think that's a nice, elegant way of having a contract that lives, a legal smart contract that lives in the blockchain. And then another factor for smart legal contracts is the active function. That is just the how, when, and why the digital components of the smart legal contract are triggered or affected by data or events generated from within the smart contract or outside the smart contract. So this is just more basically about the digitation and automation of the performance. And then finally, the digital execution mechanism. And so to be completely honest, I've seen this model published, and these two attorneys are writing, I think, a book on it. They haven't been given too much details about what that fifth factor is, but I imagine it has to do with, which blockchain the contract is being executed on and details like that. So I am going to present you with a very simple, basic, almost trivial example of a legal smart contract. And I do it to illustrate the basic concepts. And you need to understand that real life contracts are way more complicated than this. And most likely you're going to need a good lawyer and a good coder to come up with a legal smart contract that is capable of handling real life situations. But here's a very simple example just to illustrate the concepts. In here we have a legal contract where Alex offers to pay $200 in exchange for Blake transferring Blake's ownership of a kayak to Alex. Now that's basically legalese for saying that Alex offers to buy Blake's kayak for $200. Blake accepts Alex's offer to transfer Blake's ownership of the kayak to Alex in exchange for $200. So again, legalese for there's a deal between Alex and Blake, $200 for a kayak. Now, to create a legal smart contract, the agreement between Alex and Blake can be put into code, deployed, and executed in a blockchain. And so this is what a Solidity smart contract for the kayak sale could look like. Now, I created this very simple just for the purposes of this example. So here we have a variable for price. And then I decided that I'm going to complicate it a little bit by adding the birthday timestamp so that we can verify that Blake is legally competent age-wise to enter into the agreement. And then we have the address, Blake's address, where he's going to receive the money for the kayak. So here we have the constructor for this smart contract, and when we call it, we have the recipient and the birthday. And then I have a couple of modifiers. The first modifier is only Blake can call this because only Blake gets the money. And then we check the age of Blake's age because we want to make sure that Blake is of legal age. If he's not, we have a message that says Blake is not of legal age to enter into a legal contract. And then here we have the function to pay Blake. So we're transferring the $200 to Blake. Now, this is a what would be a legally enforceable smart contract. And it's very simple, very trivial, very basic. Nothing in real life is going to look like this. But again, this is just to illustrate the concepts. Now here is a smart contract that is hosted in the Azure GitHub samples. And this is a legal smart contract that really has enough sophistication to be used in real life. And this is a contract for an asset transfer. And you can see that it has an owner that is the owner of the asset. And then you have the asking price. And you basically, that's the offer. And then you have a buyer and an offer price, which basically would amount to the acceptance. And assuming that there is something can be called consideration, something of value being exchanged, right here you have the foundation, the fundamentals of a legally enforceable smart contract. And you can see that whoever created the smart contract, is very simple to verify that is something that has the fundamentals of a legally enforceable contract, as you have a function to make the offer, a function to accept the offer. Okay, so before I move on, essentially those are examples of legal smart contracts that can be programmed and deployed on the blockchain from scratch using Solidity and all the other tools for blockchain development. And as you might imagine, there's been people who've been working in this field for a while now, and they provided a lot of open source software tools for smart legal contracts. And there's been a lot of development, a lot of good projects. Here's one by the Accord project. And so if you're someone who doesn't want to start from scratch, it doesn't need to start from scratch, you can go to the Accord project and see what you can find useful in terms of drafting a legal smart contract. And then another project that is very prominent in this field is Open Law. And again, is a bunch of tools, open source in some cases, for being able to create these legal smart contracts. And that's it. That's my presentation. I hope that it was useful. And now I'm open for questions and answers if you have any. So I have a question here. Who is responsible for the actions of a smart contract, the developer or the user? So let's assume that it is a legal smart contract and that some party has an interest in enforcing that contract. So by the developer, this could get complicated because the developer's role may be simply one of creating the smart contract and deploying it to the blockchain, say, as just someone who's working for somebody else. So their only role in the matter, in the transaction, is that they were the person who developed the smart contract. So that's probably a trivial example, and that's probably not the intent of the question. But so in terms of, if someone develops a smart contract, it's part of a team, they're developing a smart contract, and they're just doing that for their work, they probably have no liability in terms of their involvement in the smart contract. But now let's say that the developer is actually someone who intends to get into a bargain, who intends that somebody interact with a smart contract and get something out of it. Well, in that case, the two parties would be, one, the developer could be thought of as potentially the offeree, and then, or the offeror, and then the user as the offeree. And so who would be responsible, say, in the eyes of the law. It depends on what the issue is and what the parties are doing in terms of interacting with that smart contract. I hate to say this, and I know it's the lawyer's standard answer, but I'm sorry, but really in this case, what I have to say is it depends. It depends on a lot more context, a lot more facts. I have another good question here. Have there been any lawsuits involving smart contracts and their enforceability? So I have a two-part answer. One part is that many of the lawsuits that are currently ongoing in lawsuits where the state has sued some of these coin projects, they all involve smart contracts at one level or another. And I think that's a good example, for example, that when developers of some coin project put out a project that turns out is not compliant with regulations, then a lot of the parties involved can bring could bring the promoters of the project, the developers of the project. It could bring all those people to court to answer for any breaches of contract. And remember, you don't have to actually have something in writing, perhaps. All you have to find is that there was a promises made. There was an offer, there was an acceptance, and there was something of value to be exchanged. Now, the second part of the answer is that I haven't been able to find a case where there is a lawsuit based on like purely kind of contractual breach of contract that relates precisely to the operation of the smart contract. There may be like issues of breaches of contract, but there are breaches of contract that are outside the scope of how the smart contract itself operates. So this is all very new still, and there's still a lot of road to go here before any of these cases make it to court. Let's see what is out here. What are the other benefits of a smart contract besides removing the third party? Well, so proponents of smart contracts have for a long time said that the great advantage of a smart contract is that it automates the performance, and the automation of performance does a couple of things. The first one it does is makes the performance of the contract very efficient, because it removes a lot of the potentially complicating human factors. So if you have some machine that executes according to what you expect it to do, and that's exactly what you expect it to do, and there are no mistakes and everything is done immediately, then there's a lot of efficiency. The other thing is that this is where the conceptual problem is that people think that automatic performance also means automatic enforcement. And that's not really true, because for most situations, perhaps you have a smart contract that performs automatically and everybody's happy. But if there is something that goes wrong, then that smart contract is no longer self-enforcing. Somebody else, usually the state or a third party, an arbitrator, has to get involved and decide what's the right thing to do. Another question, is it possible for a court to accept at some point a smart legal contract as a traditional legal contract, or it requires some special legislation? So there's been a lot of academic discussion about whether smart contracts fit under the traditional legal doctrines, or whether there needs to be additional regulation or legislation to some new aspects of smart legal contracts that may be questionable whether they can be enforced or not. And the truth is that most legal commentators that I think have it right is that, like that Senate report said, is that basically there's nothing really new about smart contracts in terms of the legal doctrines. For the most part, these contracts are just a way of automating performance, and everything else, including that, the automation of performance, falls right in place with what's already established doctrines of legal contracts. As a matter of fact, some lawyers would like for there to not be any new regulations, any new statutes, because they think they would just complicate unnecessarily what we're already able to do. Let me backtrack a little bit here in case I missed some questions here. No. I think someone asked, what is the best way to follow your work, such as your Twitter handle or YouTube handle? So I think at this point, probably the best right now is just through my website. I haven't published much of my work on social media, so I'm going to start doing that more. And I would think that probably Twitter and my website through my blog on my website would be the best way to follow. Another question here, are there limitations on where and how to use a smart contract? That's a really good question. And again, from a legal point of view, as long as a smart contract meets the requirements of the standard contract law framework, contract law doctrines, a smart contract is good to go. So in that case, it would be a smart legal contract. Now, in practical terms, when would you want to use a smart contract and when would you not want to? Typically, what is being found out is that a smart contract is usually best used in the same kinds of use cases where you find benefits of using a blockchain technology. That's, for example, where you have multiple parties that may not, that you need some sort of a trustless system, and let's say it's also a complicated transactions that need to be automated, because if these complicated transactions are automated, you gain efficiency benefits. My example, for example, of the simple sale of one item, I mean, I know that's a trivial example, but such things like, you wouldn't want to write a smart contract necessarily to sell your car to somebody else. The amount of effort involved for a one-time deal, it just wouldn't make any sense. Could smart contracts be a solution for electoral fraud? Okay, so here's something that is a little bit outside the scope of this discussion, because smart contracts, remember, if we take the definition from like what most developers know and Ethereum smart contracts, we're talking about automated programs that live in the blockchain and automate certain things. And so there's a lot of discussion that technology can be used to prevent voter fraud. Again, that's outside the scope of this, because I'm talking about contracts, promises that people made to each other and can be enforceable by the law. And then a legal smart contract is where those promises are put into code and deployed in the blockchain so that at least some of the performance is done automatically on the blockchain. I have another question here. Are there any examples of any real estate contracts? All right, so to be completely honest, I don't know of specific examples, but from what I've been reading recently, there are all kinds of tokenization of real estate. So I imagine that if I went and I looked at those contracts at their source code in detail, I would probably find all the basic requirements of legally enforceable contracts. So my guess is that yes, there are smart real estate contracts out there on the blockchain. How do you manage ambiguity of a traditional contract in a smart contract? That's a really great question, and that's been a source of a lot of academic debate, because one of the advantages of plain language contracts is that you have some flexibility with definition of terms, and in real life, and I'm a contracts attorney. In real life, the words don't necessarily precisely capture what it is that the parties intend to do, but as they start doing business, they come to understand how they want to get things done, and 90% of the time, 95% of the time, everybody gets a deal done, everybody gets their money, everybody's happy. In a smart contract, you could get in a situation where the flexibility is gone. And there's probably some hacks to that, but that's a good point. And it's being pointed out by academics very often that a smart contract could do away with the flexibility of your standard contract, and that's probably not a good thing. So one hack, and I don't want to go into this too long, but one hack is that you could start to make the smart contract account for a lot of contingencies. So you would have a lot of different if-then type functions. And so to account for things that you might foresee could happen. But again, at that point, if you end up with 1,000 different clauses, maybe that's not what you want. So what else? I have a question here. If you're completely uneducated on computer code, but are a lawyer, how can you draft a legal smart contract? Like the smart contract with a mix of words and computer code? Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And so I think that attorneys who understand code have a little bit of an advantage over attorneys who don't understand code. But the good news for attorneys who don't understand code is these open source projects that I mentioned towards the end of my discussion. And those tools are amazing. And for many lawyers who are willing to learn those tools and adopt those tools, they don't have to know anything about Solidity. They don't have to know anything about how to deploy a contract to the blockchain. None of that. All these tools make seamless basically the drafting, what lawyers are usually used to do, drafting a contract and then putting it on the blockchain. And again, I don't want to go into the details of all these tools because they're extensive and amazing, but check it out. So Open Law and the Court Project. Adam, thank you. Thank you for your support. Who else is here? How do you reconcile the differences between legal contracts and smart contracts that are already written? I need a little bit more explanation. That sounds like a good question, but I'm not sure what I need a little more on that. Let me see how I move this over here. So looking at hacks of smart contracts recently, is there any risks that Ricardian contracts can't solve for dispute resolution, like traditional contracts? Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what hacks of smart contracts. Does that mean like the recent items in the news of smart contracts where hackers exploit some function that is not a bug, is how the contract is supposed to work, but the quote unquote hacker, what they have done is figured out that if they just operate the smart contracts as it is supposed to be operated, there results some massive gain that the developers of the original smart contract didn't think, or they didn't envision that it would work this way. So if that's what we're talking about, then that's a very interesting. I think from legal doctrine point of view, and this is really what makes the big difference between smart contracts, legal smart contracts, let's say, and traditional standard contracts. So if in performing a contract, one of the parties, or let's say, for example, in this case, you have your automated agent, that's something that either one or both of the parties didn't foresee, they didn't intend that to happen, then that's where the courts can come in, a judge can come in and reform the contract and say, well, this is what happened, this is what the smart contract did, but that's not the result that either one of the parties wants or both of the parties wanted. And then you get into the legal analysis of that, and the result could very well be that the court orders that those results be reversed or modified in some way. And there is some practicalities about how you go about doing that, but in principle, you could force the parties to, let's say, I don't know, deploy a different smart contract to remedy what happened before. And in some ways, the Ethereum hack, where they reversed that, I think it was $50 million theft, or I'm not sure if it was a theft or it was just an exploit, a hack exploit. But in that case, basically the community did it. They decided to fork it and return the money to their owners who lost the money. But you could very well see that a court could have done it. If, for example, the Ethereum people decided that, no, you're out of luck, I could see there could be a class action and a judge forcing certain parties connected with Ethereum to do a hard fork. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, so Adam, that's a great question, and basically, Adam is really asking me if you have a judicial interpretation of a smart contract that differs from what is in the smart contract, what are the consequences of that? What is the result? And essentially, again, the main point of my presentation and what is actually out there in real life is that smart contracts do not live in a legal vacuum. So smart contracts are rooted in our legal system. And so if I am a person that feels like something is wrong with a smart contract or something went wrong with it, I was damaged by something in a smart contract, I could go to court, and assuming a bunch of other stuff is in place, and the judge would do the legal analysis of the smart contract. And by the way, sometimes judges get things wrong, and the judge could be wrong. But if the judge makes a decision and the whole judicial machinery goes to work, then the bottom line is that whatever the legal system decides, whether it be a judge, a jury, an arbitrator, that's what's going to stick. And as a practical matter, sometimes you can't, you can't find somebody, a real person. Maybe you only have an Ethereum address and you don't know who would have forced to perform some action to make me whole. But in principle, from a legal point of view, what a judge decides, what a jury decides, what an arbitrator decides, that's what counts, not what the legal smart contract says. How do you see smart contracts or blockchain revolutionize in the future? So, like I said, many people believe that making your typical smart contracts into legal smart contracts is going to have all kinds of benefits, efficiency benefits. It's going to allow for greater amount of contracting because people will feel like they can trust the system. And so many people go to the extent of saying, you could get to the point where smart contracts get rid of lawyers and courts, and which is not, it's very unlikely to be true. But to the extent that can be accomplished, it's going to, quote unquote, revolutionize the legal industry, revolutionize business, and such things. Okay, who else is here? Could smart contracts be used to buy a home, a car, any physical asset, etc., and have the monetary weight of support in some currency as when it is done in the traditional way? So, to the extent that I can interpret that question, I think that basically, the idea is that a smart contract, again, a legal smart contract, it can support any transaction you can think of that is, a legal transaction. So it can be used for exchange, transacting on any product, transacting on any service. So I don't. Again, just think about the fact that many legal people believe that smart contracts, if done properly, they slide right into the legal framework. And so anything that standard contracts can be used for, legal smart contracts can be used for. Again, as long as they're compliant with our legal doctrines. So yes, Adam, that's a big point. The takeaway of this discussion is that if you want a contract to be enforceable, if it's something of real value, then most likely you need to have both a well-informed, capable attorney and a very good coder. And if they're working together, or in some cases could be the same one and the same person, but that would be the best practice, is to, if you want a smart contract to be a legally enforceable smart contract, you need to put in some legal analysis, some legal eyes from the beginning. Can a smart contract be changed or updated? So this is an interesting question, because you know that once you deploy a smart contract to the blockchain, that's immutable. You can't go back and change it. I may be getting a little bit ahead of myself on that point, but my understanding is once you deploy it, it's immutable. So if you want to do like an amendment to a contract, which is something that we routinely do with regular contracts, we do amendments, then you basically end up writing another smart contract that you deploy to the blockchain. So here somebody is saying the freedom to make smart contracts with any physical and electronic asset is then accepted. So again, Booster, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question, but to the extent that I understand it is that yes, any legal purpose for which you could contract regularly, you can digitize it, you can code it, you can deploy it to the blockchain, it becomes a legal smart contract, and it's enforceable. So let's see. We're almost at 8 o'clock. I don't see any more questions. So again, please contact me through my email, johnfar.kerlee@gmail.com, on my LinkedIn page. So if that's all, thank you very much for participating in my presentation. And I'm going to say goodbye now.